environmental lobby to move away from agrochemicals, to move away from chemical fertilizers, to move away from chemical pesticides. And it was a perfectly correct and justified move to move away from the burden of chemicals on the soil in agriculture. The stronger the pressure to use biopesticides and the stronger the pressure to use biofertilizers. Both these are created through the intervention of microorganisms and therefore are patentable. Therefore, tomorrow's agriculture in three important and vital inputs, seed, fertilizer, and pesticide, will be patentable areas. And once these three sectors are patented, agriculture will be completely out of the domain of the small and marginal farmer. And it will not. That is how devastating the consequence of patenting genes will be on the agriculture. Now, at this juncture, being railroaded into Gap and Google, there is one thing that the government can do, and I, as a scientist and as convener of Gene Campaign, would appeal to the government that is to take the issue of patenting out of the current negotiations. Go ahead with the gap negotiations as they are, but take patenting out of it right now. Patenting of living organisms is a terribly complex and very, very sensitive issue. It has to be discussed. Its impact on society, its impact on the economy, its impact on for a time-bound period. We don't want to procrastinate into never. Take it out for a time-bound period and discuss the impact, build in safeguards, and then negotiate from a somewhat more equal position than today. And this is not an unprecedented step. The Canadians, as late as October, November of last year, in an effort to protect their pharmaceutical industry, the Canadians have a very successful pharmaceutical industry where they manufacture generic drugs and sell it at one-third the price to everybody else. So they're very interested in protecting their pharmaceutical industry, and this hits them as well. So they had suggested that the patenting issue should be taken out of GAP and discussed separately in a TRIPS commission and a separate commission where all of these points that are raised could be discussed and a decision taken with somewhat greater time. This Canadian proposal did find acceptance from the Nordic bloc and from the European community. Why I'm saying this is that even at this stage, it is possible for us to intervene and to ask for a pause and to ask for support and to lobby for support to deal with this issue in a more justifiable way. Because if it is not done, what is being sought today in terms of patenting amounts in effect to an attempt by the industrialized countries of the North to indulge in a colonization again of the developing countries, using this time the techniques of biotechnology and recombinant DNA. Thank you.
That's the trouble. There's a whole bunch of journalists, colleagues of mine sitting in front of you, all laughing away. It was very difficult then. Remember what I was going to tell you.
Standard journalistic denial. Standard journalistic denial.
Absolutely. It's very difficult. You've been listening to people for 2 hours, and you've heard some outstanding presentations. I have learned a great deal, and so I'm sure have you. So you're going to have a very hard time because we've got another 20 minutes to go. I do promise it will be 20 minutes. I took great trouble this morning to compress what I had to say in 20 minutes. And also I'm glad, coming at the end of this whole session, that what I have to say has not been directly tackled by the previous three speakers. And yet it is an important issue, it's one that is worrying all of us. In a sense, it's not purely an economic issue, it's a political issue. And the politics of reform is just as important as economics. In fact, at the moment, they're much more important. The question that I wish to address myself to is this fear that is being expressed frequently in the newspapers by several of our political parties, particularly those on the left, that we are being railroaded by the secular victims, forced into surrenders of sovereignty by the World Bank and the IMF. But more generally, behind the World Bank and the IMF, the USA, and still more generally, the developed industrialized countries, that in the attempt to liberalize and to make the Indian economy more efficient, to get over the economic crisis of last July, we have taken actions which we might not have taken quite in the same way, or might not have taken at all. We might have either phased them differently, or we might have postponed or in fact refused to take certain actions and taken others. But that choice, that sovereignty of decision making has been taken out of our hands. And behind this specific charge is the more general fear that the global free market that we're trying to join, or being forced to join, will make us lackeys of the dominant industrial power. That in some way, getting meshed in with a global economic system, production or marketing, or both, in fact, has to be both. As Mr. Dugan said, there are no halfway houses or globalization. Now, that in that, we will lose our sovereignty. Now, this will have, well, this so it will have many effects. But one of the most important effects, one that worries people, is that as we integrate more and more with the world market, the poor in our country will get more and more individualized. They're already poor, they become poorer. That's not, again, an invalid fear. Firstly, because quite apart from the fact that domestically we can't afford the kind of subsidies we're giving in many areas, not just agriculture, not just fertilizer, but in subsidies of all purposes. But that cutting any set of subsidies means raising prices. And if you look at it, the subsidies traditionally for political reasons, and I think quite valid reasons on balance, we have carried it too far, have been on essentials produced by the poor, consumed by the poor. They have been on food grain, they have been on fertilizer, they have been on kerosene, and where you haven't got overall subsidies, you've got dual pricing of sugar. So, attempts to remove subsidies, there is irrigation, road transport, particularly rural transport. All these are subsidized to varying degrees, and the main consumers are the least well-off people in our country. And removing that, raising those, will give you, removing those subsidies will give you higher prices and lower real. The other thing is that as you integrate more into world markets, more of your products start going out, and they then start being priced more and more closely to international prices. Now, we've had this happen with fish, we've had this happen with silk, we've had this happen with certain foodstuffs. The moment that basmati rice, for example, the moment that they do find an external market or an import market, the domestic price in India skyrockets. Therefore, for this complex of reasons, there is a strong lobby, maybe lobby is too strong a word for that, but there is a section of the population that believes that India should opt out of the globalization process. And that instead of looking outwards, we must look inwards and do a better job of developing our own country. We must look at our own poor. We must concentrate not so much on growth at any cost, but employment and equity. Now, thus, you get nationalism allies itself with humanitarianism and produces a strong urge to look inwards, not outwards, and to cut off India from the world market instead of integrating with it. And Francis follows certain attitudes to big business, for example, or to modern technology also. Big business is bad. What we need are millions of small producers, or thousands of small producers. Latest modern technology is not a good thing because it is labor intensive. What we need is appropriate technology. Appropriate is defined by everybody in different ways, but certainly appropriate technology. Now, I'm not against, in principle, either of these two. But I mean, there are some ironies that emerge. One of them is that the millions of small producers, or thousands of small producers and traders for whom the humanitarian left does feel so strongly, are now voting solidly for the medium way. And don't subscribe to many of the humanitarian values of the left. And there must be something flawed in what you bring this about. Somewhere you've got to re-examine what we're doing for. But let me therefore start looking for these flaws in what really started off as what our values concerned. What has gone wrong in their implementation? Let's take the question of sovereignty first. We did not lose our sovereignty in July when we went in for standby against the IMF. I think we lost our sovereignty at least 10 years ago when we began to consume more and more focused on oil, but could not produce enough that could be exported to pay for our imports. Now, I would in fact put it not even 10 but 15, 16 years ago, maybe as far back as 1971, for a reason that I'll make clear. You see, we've had 8.6% industrial growth rate in the 80s. Even if modernization of plants that was 20 and 30 years old by that time had not put an extra strain, just the import component of this production would have trebled in absolute terms. That is unavoidable. No economy in the world today develops entirely on domestic raw materials. India, we did have, way back in the first plan, possibly early second plan, the idea that really India was a large country, richly endowed in raw materials, richly endowed in the large markets, and therefore we could turn inward, and we framed our strategy of development on self-reliance, which was really do with as few imports as possible, not export more. There was export mechanism in our self-reliance. But it doesn't matter how slowly or fast you grow. A day comes when your domestic raw material base is not sufficient to meet your needs. You have to start importing and more. Now that day really came quite a long time back, probably in the early 70s. Well, never there completely, but we began to really step up our imports. Now today, if you look at just the raw materials position, we are out of coking coal and have been for some time. We're importing coking coal for our steel plants for more than 10 years. If you look at oil, we went up to about 70% self-sufficiency very briefly. We are back down to 55 and we're going to keep dropping. We're going to predominantly in oil. If you look at copper, we set up a huge and extremely expensive public sector enterprise which has remained sick ever since it started. And the main reason is that we wanted to do it on the basis of some of the poorest grade copper ores in the world. And yet I remember in the 50s, Committee on Public Undertakings reports, one after the other, saying India is endowed with abundant deposits of copper. You can go down the line, but the fact is, quite apart from basic raw materials, as you industrialize, your requirements of the inputs into your final product keep diversifying. Now, we've already heard about the globalization of this process taking place. I'm talking even within the purely internal, relatively early capitalist, early development, early industrialized Indian economy is already there. So, when this happened, the first response of the Indian government was to to try and increase exports. They did try to increase exports, but they tried to do it through devaluation and devaluation alone. The first big devaluation in 1956 was an adjustment to past increases in cost of production here, which were far in excess of those abroad. But from 71 onward, we began devaluing continuously. We have devalued to the point where, compared to the late 50s, the rupee is worth 6% of its original value in relation to the Swiss franc. 7.5%, I think it is about 8% in relation to the yen, about 17-18% in relation to the US dollar, and about 28% in relation to the pound. That's the kind of devaluation we've had. And in spite of that, this crisis of foreign exchange has gotten worse and worse and worse. And the next stage was we began borrowing. That's what happened in the 80s. To meet this increasing demand, we began borrowing. And we borrowed more and more, and the figures have already been given to you, so I'm not going to go into it again. The borrowing also was a reflection of the fact we could not export. So two things became clear by the time the crisis was happening. One, that prices alone are not the problem. India can't produce what the world wants to buy, other than agricultural products. Secondly, that sorry, lost my train of thought. I have to look at my paper again. Well, that's enough. Actually, it became very clear that India could not produce what it could sell, and that prices would not help us. Low prices would not be the solution. The economic liberalization, therefore, has been one which has been intended to make it more possible to export what is to produce what is today, what can be exported. And I found this. The effect of devaluation, other than that, is that it has made it less and less possible for us to export. This is the second point I wanted to make. Why is that? Because it made the modernization of capital more and more expensive. We had to as the import of capital became more expensive, we had to postpone modernization. Now, we could not export more because how does an industry that is set up only to cater to the home market with no equity collaboration, no technology update, how does it manage to export? In short, how do you export the ambassador card? This is the basic question. Now, if devaluation does not alone work, then all the present reforms are only intended to make us join the world market system. Our goals today are therefore the same as they were before. So this is the point I was sorry. We are trying to regain our lost sovereignty. Unless we can export enough, we will not be able to avoid getting into another crisis 2 years down the line. If you borrow $15 billion to get over the last crisis, and you're still not able to export, next time will be your debt will be $100 billion. And when you go to the IMF then, they say, sorry, you could not make the structural adjustments last time, therefore we cannot give you any more money. After that, default will follow, and then the economy will contract in a much worse way. In the attempt to open up and increase our exports, we are doing it at the most difficult time in world history. While we were looking inward, the world was moving ahead. Inexorably, markets were becoming global, which you have heard in great detail. And the efficiency increases that went with it, with the increased competitions, just kept speeding up and left us further and further behind. The key factor in all this was technology. Now we've heard about individual elements of that technology, the computer revolution, transport, etc. But in totality, it's not just here, it's in every single area that technology has new technology, introduction of new technology has speeded up and throughout the world. In the last 40 years, in fact, what has happened is that the relationship between capital and technology has got reversed. Previously, it was capital, the possession of capital, its accumulation by a country that gave power and dominance. And all the national efforts of countries were bent towards that purpose. One of the results of this was colonialism, where it resulted from the desire for secure markets and secure sources of raw materials. And the kind of conflicts that created between industrialized nations led to 2 world wars and eventually the use of the bomb. Now, in the last 40 years, all the capital of the earlier times had in it a technology. Technology was handmade. Capital to be used had to be turned into machines. But the fact is that technological development was very slow. Most of it took place on the factory floor. One reason, of course, was that till about the mid-19th century, cyber individuals found this form. But with the emergence of large monopoly concerns in the late 19th century and the institutionalization of research, the flow of technology speeded up. New inventions moved faster and faster. And as more and more companies put in money in research and forged ahead, the concentration of productive power in larger and larger monopoly concerns, that also went hand in hand. So the two went together. Of course, the difference in input in the last 40 years especially, but that's generically of the same kind. You could think of the state as being yet another large corporation, which is going in for technology. And while much of it went initially into war, it also went after that, very soon thereafter, into the production of commercial. So, what happened was that as the pace of technological development speeded up, gradually it became capital that became the handmaiden of technology. The period of obsolescence grew shorter and shorter. And capital, instead of being fixed, became more and more liquid. Eventually, as technology came, you had to retire your capital, get the money back, put it into the new technology with the new machine. And it is this that has changed everything in the world, because you see, it would be interesting to discuss whether we have now exited, in fact, from the age of capitalism as seen by Marx, and entered a new age, let's call it the age of technology, which Marx did not foresee, but where the same relations of dominance and dependence between two broad classes, the possessors and the non-possessors of technology, have continued to work. Or whether what we are seeing just now is just a phase shift within capitalism. But whatever you may define it as, the fact is that this has totally changed the nature of the world. And we have to understand the profound differences that it has brought if we are to chalk out a meaningful strategy for investment in India. The changes that have come about are, and there's only some of them. One, that the countries that lost the Second World War have won the peace. Germany and Japan. And this happened because, having lost all their colonies, having lost their markets, having even lost the pre-Second World War industrial structure, they had to start afresh, and they had to depend on nothing but technology. In fact, my first editor at the Times of India, Mr. Shamla, went to Japan in 1957. He was very fond of telling a story. He met the head of the Sony Corporation. And this was a gentleman in blue overalls. And he explained how he set up the company. He said after the war there were just two engineers, two of them. And they were electronics engineers, and they wanted to set up a company. And the decision they took was that they would introduce one new product in the market every year. Until 1957, and maybe even till today, that basic concept is not clear to me. That is what being on the leading edge of technology meant. And it happened in the case of Japan and Germany very large times, because they had nothing else to fall back on. The second is that the countries that won the war have lost the peace. I mean, the most spectacular example, of course, is the UK. I mean, I'm not talking only about the industrialized countries. We'll come to Soviet Union later. But the USA, is now among the major industrial countries. It is an industrial power that is slipping in relative terms to certainly Germany and Japan, and possibly really the whole EEC and Japan. In the commodity area, it has already lost preeminence in just about all areas. It's still a major player, it's lost preeminence in a major way. And that is because the US had a slightly different experience. It was a major developer of original technology, of science. It's a real powerhouse. But because of its Cold War considerations, and the concern for safeguarding a global economy, a global free market, which is really a free market when it was conceived, where US goods reigned supreme, it put the technology into production of weapons and not of products for the market. It's Japan that took much of this technology and applied it to commercial products. So, that is the second important change. The third was that technology was first converted to power through weapons, but that was a short-term conversion. In the long run, the abiding and permanent basis of power now is dominance in trade. This I hardly need to explain to you, but you can see that Japan, with no defense budget worth the name, or at least in terms of GNP, is easily the most dominant and possibly even in some ways daunting. I mean, if you were a US producer and you were facing Japan and Japanese competition, it's a terrifying prospect. And that's even true of the Germans today. Even in the automobile industry, even in the luxury car market, they're being sideswiped by the Germans. The fourth is that technology has made large-scale war obsolete. Border conflicts, yes. War, as we have known it, particularly in the 20th century, is now obsolete. And there are two reasons for this. One is that the very same increase in the speed, in the rate of obsolescence, caused by the acceleration of technological development, has made the maintenance of defense preparedness at the leading edge more and more expensive. And it's become prohibitively expensive not just for the Soviet Union, not just, but also it became prohibitively so for Britain, which as far back as 1962 dropped its independent missile development program, and continued to drop programs ever since. It became prohibitively expensive for the French, who after creating a little force that France had quietly forgotten, more or less forgotten about it. It certainly was one of the factors that drove the Soviet Union into the ground. And it was revealed in the fact that even for a little war like the Gulf War, the really little war in relation to the wars that we fought in the past, the US had to hand a begging bowl around. Because the kind of money involved in just those 6 weeks of war was considered to be too great a strain for one country. In any case, there were political reasons for doing that. They didn't have to do it for purely economic reasons. But the idea that even this kind of a war requires sharing of expenses among the richest countries in the world, it defines just where we are on that. But the second and more important reason why war has become obsolete is that trade does not brook war. If you are seeking dominance through trade, the one thing you don't want is to have trade disrupted, and major wars will disrupt trade. So, in fact, that is, to me, is the most important lesson from the Gulf War. Ultimately, to not because Saddam was a bad guy or anything like that, but that he took action in an area involving a vital internationally traded commodity that was unilateral and could not be tolerated because it could set off other such actions which would disrupt the entire thing. The fifth important thing is that this trade is what has meshed the world together into one system. For the last 45 years, international trade has grown about 3% more rapidly than national GNP, world GNP. So that the share of trade, the ratio of trade to GNP for the world as a whole has more than doubled since 1950. Now, that means that everybody's life is that much more intimately connected with the lives of others all over the world. That's yet another reason why war is becoming more important to sustain as a proposition. Now, today's successful countries are those whose share of trade to GNP is rising, and those whose currencies are being revalued. Today's unsuccessful countries are those whose currencies are falling, or the share of trade is declining. India fits comfortably into both the categories. Therefore, no matter what our domestic rate of GNP growth, if there is such a thing as an international global rate of growth, we are losers. And we will keep falling further behind unless there is a major change. The inward-looking, why did this happen to India? Well, inward-looking policy structure, they made us lose our share in world trade, which came down from, I think it was 1.4 to 1.5, 0.4%, and the rupee to, as I said, 6, 17, 28% of its value in different currencies. These inward policies have made us miss out on the 4 important sunrise industries of the post-Second World War period. These were the automobiles, shipbuilding, chemicals, and most importantly, war electronics. We did not understand the value of time. We did not see why we needed to have these things. While everybody was going in for large television industries, we were wondering whether we needed television at all. While they were going in for color television, we were wondering whether we ever needed to change from black and white to color. And so on. The examples can be multiplied ad infinitum. The fact is that these sunrise industries, the countries that were able to latch onto them, witnessed experienced explosive growth. And that was mainly Southeast Asia. We failed all of those. Today, in fact, the only one of these 4 industries where we are making a belated comeback is chemicals. And there is a very good reason for that. In chemicals, the product is undifferentiated and brand names don't count. So if you can produce a product and it's cheaper than what your rivals are producing, you can sell it. That's your anti-dumping duties don't get you across that. But in all the other 3 industries, not so much shipbuilding, but just certainly the other 2, automobiles and electronics, you need now an extensive after-sales network. You need brand names, and both of these brand names you can only get, or you need to be given a share of market, and you can only do that through a period of junior partnership with large multinationals. Where that will lead you is very difficult to tell, but there is certainly nothing written, nothing preordained that you will not become. You will not produce companies that will stand up on their own and give competition to the very best in the world. Until as late as the late 60s, most people probably have forgotten or don't know, that Japanese companies like Asahi and Akai were selling their products in the American market as subsidiaries of small, relatively unknown American companies. The Asahi was being sold as the Honeywell Pentax. The Honeywell was a big truck. It's not much of a company now. The Akai was being sold as the Roberts. Today, Korea is going down exactly the same road. Gold Star, Samsung have been selling in the American market for years, and Sears' television sets, their own brand or Macy's own brand, and it's only very recently that they have begun to advertise under their own name. When they felt they were big enough, powerful enough, could afford the advertising, could afford to maintain offices abroad and servicing networks. So there is nothing immutable about it. Dependence is not permanent. But one thing is certain, the attempt to entirely cut us off from the world led to a far more crippling and humiliating dependence than anything that we might have experienced otherwise. That's very late for us to try and change over. As Mr. Dubey has pointed out, it's the most inauspicious of times. But perhaps it's not too late for us. At any rate, I don't believe it is. It will take a very long time to go into the details of that. It's interesting that if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, the discomfiture of East Europe, it is for exactly the same reasons. The Soviet Union preeminently was a non-market economy, inward-looking. It had the largest production of steel, I think the largest production of oil in the world, coal, the most resource-rich country in the world, and it went up. Because technology became of no significance whatever, and technology could not be of significance because it did not have competition. We are infinitely better placed than the Soviet Union, and I'm glad to see at long last that an article in the Financial Times has accepted. We are familiar with and we have a vigorous market economy. We have well-articulated and responsible and well-developed financial institutions. They could do better, and certainly in terms of methods of work, they could do better. And we have got the basic infrastructure, although a lot more needs to be done there. We have cheap labor for those industries where labor is important. We have devalued to a point where in fact our raw material base, such as it is very cheap. So we have a whole lot of advantages going for us for becoming part of the global production process, which we described earlier. I therefore don't feel disheartened about it. Most important of all, we did create in this period of inward lookingness a very large entrepreneurial class, of which the best are as good or better than anyone in the world. And competition will undoubtedly weed out many. But those who remain will challenge the rest of the world. I'm absolutely convinced of that. As I finish, may I just ask one last question and answer also. What kind of world are we moving into? I think we're moving into a world obviously of higher and higher interdependence because the trade to GNP ratios are not being reversed. Growth rate. Secondly, there is a global economic order emerging, where in fact the most successful trading nations are calling the shots. The rest of us are being arranged in a pyramidal structure or hierarchy of varying degrees of dependence. The question that I want to ask is that if there is a single global economic trading and industrial system, is it any longer even meaningful to talk about dependence? Isn't everybody ultimately going to be dependent on everybody else? Yes, some people have a much better deal than others. And this is why the vitalization of multilateral institutions, which Mr. Dubey talked about, and also talked about, I think that is absolutely essential. And India can play a very important role in that. We will by no means fit at the bottom of this pyramid. We will be fitting quite a ways up. At the bottom, I regret, will be smaller commodity producers of Africa and Southeast Asian countries. But what we do after that, whether we claw our way upwards or whether we go downwards, that depends entirely upon us. Third, I think you will see a common and increasingly reinforced determination of all countries to maintain the political status quo in the world. Which means that there will be a very strong pressure towards avoiding war or trying to anticipate possible future threats to war, threats of war and disruption. We have a certain natural advantage here. We are seen as a country that believes in these values. Much of the increase in interest, at least at the official level, between and communication connection between India and the US that's taking place now, is actually coming out of an awareness in the US policymaking circles, that the world is facing, with the end of ideology, the rise of fanaticism. I say plural, because I'm not specifically referring to Islam. Even that has two varieties. So, and in that, India does not fit in that side. It's the irrational side of the world order. It fits in more in the rational side. I think that we can take advantage of this. There are unfortunately also bad developments taking place. Some of these may be transitional, but it is our duty to speak out strongly against them. I think the first one is the strong propensity that is emerging to use global interconnection of trade as an instrument of that. Developed countries, governments are not any less susceptible to powerful organizations than ours are, probably more so. We've had several examples discussed today. And there's no point in, you can agree or disagree about the extent of influence, but the fact that the influence is there and that private interest is continually being sought to be converted into national interest. I think that is we are all facing that, and we are being threatened with a kind of blackmail. The second is that there is a rapid erosion of the concept of national sovereignty. And the areas from which this erosion is coming in, concern over human rights, concern over nuclear proliferation, concern over environment, and concern over trade policy, trade and investment policy. The settlements that will take place in this will reflect the relative strengths and weaknesses, economic strengths and weaknesses of the countries of the world. And there is where I have my greatest fear. In the Bretton Woods system, one of the reasons it didn't work and finally collapsed in 1971 was precisely because the countries that had trade surpluses, broadly speaking the donor countries, refused to accept any of the very same disciplines that today, for instance, the US is insisting that Japan should accept, or following inflationary or reflationary policies at home when you have got a trade surplus. So all adjustment under Bretton Woods fell upon the developing countries, and the result was that more and more of us were plunged into the debt trap. I fear that the same thing will happen if we are not careful. And I do wish to sound a note of warning even to the developed countries that if ultimately this thing is pushed too far, will lead to a disruption. I do not know how and where it will start, but I do fear that the trigger for that disruption will be the kind of fundamentalism that is coming up. It will come from domestic politics of these loser nations. And therefore, economics today, we're talking about production no longer being globalized. We're talking about markets being globalized. May I add one more point here? I think politics has become globalized too. I've just been told I took 40 or 20 minutes. Thank you very much. That actually was the end of what I wanted to say. Thank you.
We have a coffee break and then but please don't give more than 15 minutes for the coffee break.
I'll just be as brief as possible. First and foremost, I think while globalization is certainly a very growing trend, both in the production and the global marketplace as well, We mustn't forget that it's also a very unequal and iniquitous process. And has very strong biases in a variety of biases. The ownership and control patterns in the globalization process are extremely skewed. Let me just give you a few examples. The world's largest 200 corporations produce close to a fourth of all the goods and services in the non-socialist world. This share has been rising roughly at the rate of 1% or so every year. But the interesting thing is that all but 15 of these 200 corporations are located in just 12 countries. They're headquartered in just 12 countries. If you include South Korea among the developing countries, then it is the only developing country, the only third world country, which figures in the list of headquarters where the top 200 corporations are located. Again, look at the world's top banks. The top 100 includes 30 Japanese banks, which control roughly half the total assets of the world banking system as a whole. Similarly, in specific product lines, you will see a fantastic concentration and a growing concentration and a growing bias in favor of very small numbers and a far more diffuse picture in respect of very large numbers of consumers, producers, market leaders, and so on and so forth. Second, and very important, that for all the growing trend, globalization still excludes the vast majority of the world's poor. Let's make no confusion about this. Even in the rich countries, something like 20 to about a fifth to a third of the population is excluded effectively from access to the so-called global marketplace. And in the third world, the proportion is usually as high as 80%. So we're not really talking about a truly global market, but a market which is ultimately confined to about a third of the world's population. This proportion has not been growing very fast, unlike the proportion of number of corporations which control a very large chunk of the total output of corporations. Third, and very important again, is that increasingly the third world is breaking up into two different sectors, if you like. Those are minorities, such as South Korea and Taiwan, which are in the NIC category and which are growing fast, which are exporting manufacturers and so on, while the rest of the third world is sinking into what you might call a large enclave or series of enclaves or reserve of cheap labor, very low cost labor. I'll just give you one example. Today, the world textiles production is by and large shifting very rapidly, has by and large shifted to the third world, so far as at least weaving is concerned, and very large numbers of people who are now producing the world's textiles sold in the first world, are employed at wages which are roughly 1/7 lower than their counterparts in the developed countries. So countries like Guatemala, for instance, boast of very cheap labor. In fact, the labor contractors will advertise the availability of very cheap labor. I have a clipping which I forgot to bring down, which talks of this particular woman called Rosa Martinez in Guatemala, whom you could employ in 1982 at a rate as low as 59 cents an hour to do high quality work, export-worthy textile production. By 1989, Rosa could be employed at 33 cents an hour. So this is what is happening. This is very important. Fourth, the transfer, there is increasing transfer of hazardous technologies to the third world. The hazardous processes technologies which is integral to the process of globalization. It is the redistribution of the division of labor, which is taking place at the expense of the third world, which shouldn't forget either. Processes such as dyestuffs manufacture, certain leather processing, chemicals production, especially hazardous chemicals and so on, are increasingly shifting to the third world, and it's now estimated that by the end of the century, something like 2/3 of technologies and products that are categorized by the WHO as highly hazardous or extremely hazardous will have moved to the south from the north. This again represents a great inequity in the whole process of growth. And finally, the environmental costs of globalization are enormous, simply enormous. And this is probably the most repelling feature of this globalization. Now, what are these environmental costs? I'll just spend 2 minutes to explain the whole point. I think, by and large, the industrialization of the first world took place through the use of very, very large quantities of global environmental resources. For instance, it led to the burning of large quantities of fossil fuels, the consumption of very hazardous chemicals which leave deposits and residues in the atmosphere, and which are now creating the phenomenon of global warming. And let's be clear about it. If you're talking about assigning blame for the phenomenon of global warming, then the first world will have to take the bulk of the blame. And by the bulk, I mean 80%, 90%, depending on what kind of categories you're dealing with. In the case of the ozone layer and its destruction thanks to CFCs, the first world accounts for 90% of the CFC molecules that are still to be found in the atmosphere, which destroy the upper atmosphere and preventing the ozone layer from performing its function. Now, some of this has actually involved a complete perversion in the attempt to reverse the process. What the first world is doing through various conventions, which have to force international treaty laws, is to seek to distribute the blame evenly. Okay? Which means that although the problem has been caused by the first world, the third world is being asked to, pay as much, or in fact in some ways even more heavily, for the task of correcting the damage that has been inflicted. This is especially true of the Montreal Protocol, which pertains to the ozone layer, and which would involve a very severe setback in the absence of adequate countermeasures, a severe setback to developmental efforts in many third world countries if they were to be forced to phase out the production of CFCs, which they need in refrigeration, air conditioning, in chemicals production, electronics production, and so on, without there being an alternative. In fact, I think the first world has been insistent on developing this convention, which is extremely iniquitous and unjustified. And the same model of the Montreal Protocol is now being used for a convention on global warming and a biodiversity convention, which Suman was talking about. The whole question of distribution of plant genetic resources is being posed in such a way as would make it difficult for the third world to say that these are our resources, as distinct from the common global resources of mankind as a whole, and yet refuse to accept the more onerous kinds of plant breeders' rights and patterns in plant genetic resources. The third world's position so far has been, yes, we accept that this is a common heritage of humanity, but equally, the North must accept the historic function played by the farmers of the South by compensating them through what are called farmers' rights, i.e. some more of repaying the debt that the first world owes to the third world. And even this is now sought to be changed in favor of the North. The third world has to be is told that it must accept that this is a common heritage of mankind, and yet must allow patenting and other forms of intellectual property protection in respect of its own plant genetic resources and material which is being effectively transported from here and then manipulated and sent back. Now, These are the kinds of inequities that have grown as a result of the fake notion of globalization. When I say fake, I mean let us not fool ourselves that there is something ennobling, natural, equal, spontaneous, and inevitable about this process. It has been brought about. It has been designed to be iniquitous. It has had very strong biases to start with, and these biases have grown stronger. And so I don't see globalization as something to be celebrated, as something to be accepted passively, but certainly as surely providing a context within which the world today operates. I'm not asking for an opting out, but certainly I'm asking for a modification of the terms of integration into the global economy. And I think it's very important that we understand some of the imperatives of this.
You know whether globalization is right or wrong, or anger, but I would like to make just a few more comments on two or three things. First, the globalization is evident here because in our dress we are already globalized. And please remember, when President Bush was in Japan, one of the things we saw on the television screen, the Japanese were screaming, "We have already adopted your dress, we have already adopted your food, why do you want to adopt your automobile?" That kind of a scenario, whereas in those who say, "I'm very highly competent, I'm part of the leader of the global market," when they are today, trying to fight the war on their own terms. So everybody is imposing a term, and it's not as though scientific or very objective principles are going to guide globalization. There are going to be, we call it biases, we call it national interest, you call it corruption interest, lobbies, but all these interests are going to weigh heavily in the process of globalization. There are 4 or 5 kind of, well, I do not know whether I call it equations or I call it that they are factors which I think one has to keep in mind, especially for countries who have, we can say, India has missed many opportunities. It's actually a crisis we have created by missing opportunities in the 60s, in fact, missing opportunities in the 70s, perhaps missing opportunities in the 80s because the wrong kind of liberalization took place. And you have to pay a price for it. The point is, we must be cautious in the kind of policies we adopt to be integrated in the globalization, so that it does not again become a factor in missed opportunity. I remember a Japanese friend telling me some time ago that India and Japan have the same analysis of a problem, but somehow or the other Japan always reaches one conclusion, India and Tali the way. So I do not know. Same kind of problem, produces 2 kinds of solution. And the Japanese solution have made them world leaders in trade. Our solutions have made us dependents, on others, reliance on others. That's the kind of thing that has happened. So, if you want really to be part of the global system and yet help our own country also, then we have to really look at the domestic routes that will keep our own trade and trading interests in the forefront, and not the mere slogan of either liberalization or globalization. An issue that is going to weigh very heavily is, are politics, international politics and trade related, or there is a politics of international trade? And are we taking adequate cautions to see that we understand the games of the politics. I'm afraid sometimes I have felt that we have somehow or the other closed our eyes to the politics of international trade. And that's one of the reasons for the missed opportunity. Now, our share in the global trade is very small. Our share, in welfare from exports is also comparatively small. Mr. Dubey in the morning spoke of some of the people talking of Fortress Europe by 1992 and strengthening as time passes. Now, the share of exports in the total economy or total welfare of the country may be important in the kind of attitude one has to globalization. Of the three major countries, United States has only 11.5% of that share, Japan 15.5%, or Germany 32.5%. So Germany, in effect, has been saying now that we will be against Fortress Europe. And to that, of course, there's one factor where one has to look at how important export is to a particular country. And will that export commitment or export share make them really a prisoner of this kind of blocks? I talked of blocks, and blocks will be a reality. There's no question of blocks are all right, but individual countries will matter. I personally feel that blocks will matter and matter much more. The second issue, that will merge along with this one, the export share, will be the politico-ethnic affinity. As it is being talked out that Western Europe, the EC, will perhaps much greater interest in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, and rather than looking much further away. Japan will concentrate more and more on Southeast Asia, and now we are concentrating largely on Southeast Asia. In fact, two interesting things have come recently. One was that a report on the Singapore Time magazine seminar, in which even though Southeast Asian countries are afraid of Japan, they expressed their fear of Japan. They wanted United States to be present, militarily in that sea, the Pacific, so that at least, that particular political domination fear, which possibly totally subvert their economy, is not there. And yet, they also want an inner bloc. And India perhaps is not one of those who is a very much welcome commodity even in that particular sector. In fact, Japan is participating in India in the last 10 years. It's very good. But once again, now the Japanese friends have been saying that our involvement in India will be only to an extent. Beyond that extent, we are wary of India. Because India is a country we do not understand. Sorry, if they have started understanding in the last 4 or 5 years, I do not know, but otherwise that's exactly what they have been, some of the friends have been telling me. So that is, all this combined is a total, as I look at it, a total package of politics of trade on which we have to, I think, develop a much greater understanding and not be very euphoric about our own values in international globalization. The second is that globalization will be, or in particular, talking specifically in particular of external direct financial investment in the country, things from the country's point of view, will be influenced by the structure of industry in some of the countries with which we intend or we will be seeking, collaboration. Now, share of a small and medium industry in their own industrial structure is progressively going up. And share of the large industry is coming down. With the result that collaboration, and in collaboration we always look at the big, the gigantic. It happens here also. official teams, we have been trying always to negotiate with the Birlajis and the Goenkajis and others. And we have forgotten that Bihar also has a small band of entrepreneurs, We are not prepared to give them that part of the money, them, but you expand and you get into new areas. Now, in Japan, I think between 1985 and 88, there is a kind 1985, the share of a small and medium firm, mentioned about the USA also, that the smaller ones are more vibrant in the economy. But they suffer from the kind of disability which was mentioned by the friend from the USA. And apart from that, they also suffer from manpower and to some extent finances, and they want to be in the country nearby in spite of the information revolution. So this has to be also kept in view. All that we may try to do. There are hurdles, if we cross that hurdles, well and good, but we should be prepared for such. The third is internationalization. I entirely agree with Mr. Dubey and Chandra Jha, but internationalization, multilateral trade, yes, that route is the safer route, but not always a route free of risks. Because the Bretton Woods arrangement was an arrangement of power, not only of money. So the voting power based on economic power. When the financial crisis of the 70s came, a lot was talked about. There was also one of the members talking about it, that there should be reform of the international financial institutions also, not only the foreign exchange regime. Nothing came of it. In a small way, in a small area, then some of us thought that all right, let there be one institution, which shows some difference in regard to managerial power on international finance. And that was the International Fund for Agricultural Development. The structure of the governing body was different, not like the ADRI. But it remained, of course, a small baby. So, power versus development in regard to multilateral financial institutions is very much of a live issue. And multilateral financial institutions are also focused on power, and therefore, while we must get multilateral, we must not feel that all is the same. Another issue will be the role of domestic demand and globalization. Now, India is a vast market. The last 30 years I've only been hearing outside India that you are a big market. You are a big market. You are a big market. So everybody, while they are prepared to import, are looking for exports to India. When you go into collaboration also, the other day when these 21 portions of the Japanese delegation came, one portion was this, that you are also always putting obligation to export. But the internal market is too big, why should we not be allowed to send back profits, on the internal only, even when you are not earning foreign exchange. And in any case, in our switch on and switch off, export history, the indigenous companies who have the capability to export are sometimes very shy of exporting, because the margin of profit in the internal market, unfortunately, is much higher than margin of profit in the export market. So they feel that why should I not make more money? And somebody said, why not? More money is there, so more money is there. You are working for money. Therefore, both diversification and expansion of export market for an economy like India, even we try to improve our competitive edge, is full of heavy hurdles. And we should not get disheartened very soon. The process is not a process that can will result in a year or 2 years or 3 years. It's going to take much longer time than what is being projected as of now. Finally, and that's where the first statistics will prove that larger the country, in any case, export commitment will be, export share will be a smaller. United States can export a smaller share. So the smaller countries have much greater advantage in possibly they do not have to look to the lot of internal compulsions. As many internal compulsions as a very large country, a very diverse country like India, a federal country, a smaller country. And countries with very large population also have some liability, compared to countries with small population. Now these are 5 or 6 issues which it appears to me we can ignore at our place. So, as I said, we are part of the global system already. As far as India is concerned, it is not that India has not been isolated like the Eastern Bloc. And mind you, Eastern Bloc also were not that much isolated. I remember once dealing with them as the chief executive of a public undertaking. And country after country, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, everywhere they said, we are sorry, you may be public undertaking, so what? We are interested in our own profits. We are interested in our selling or gaining in this. So I'm sorry, no preference. Let us talk, business. And on the business also they said, well, this much impossible. Give me this much cut. And the cut could be given to us in rupees, there's no need for you to give me in black and white, And market is yours. This business is yours. So even when we thought, that that was a totally controlled market, a lot of value attached, to ideology and all that. We were looking at the domestic interests. So we must identify the domestic interests, of India and try to also look at them in trying to integrate further in the global market.
Thank you. We have 3 more speakers on the list, but before I give the floor to them, I would request them to confine their interventions to maximum of 3 minutes. If they can do with 2 minutes, it is better. Because we have got 3 full presentations still left, and after that others might like to comment on the presentations. So the next speaker on my list is Mr. B. Simha. Please, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I requested for only 2 minutes, so I'll confine 2 minutes. We have discussed a number of topics today: free market, globalization, international trade, economic development of India, economic development of Bihar. And it's a good thing we have discussed everything. We don't get an opportunity in Patna every day to listen to talented speakers from Delhi, like Mr. Matkar, Mr. Kamla Prasad, Dr. Barnett, Dr. Suman Sahai. At the end of the day, what I feel, while many economic theories are being poured here, and a man like me doesn't understand economics. Yeah. What I understood from Dr. Barnett was that the pace of technology is forcing globalization. It's your informatics, or it's your space travel, or it's going to the moon. All this put together are forcing globalization. Whether we like it or not, it's not for us. It's the pace of technology. Now what Dr. Bernard said, decentralization of production. Once that comes, it's not multinational anymore. It's international, it is binational. Because 2 nations will come to an understanding. Now having said that, I was talking during lunch break to Dr. Bernard that I'd like to organize a seminar on management of technology. I didn't know what he was going to talk about. Then came the paper by Dr. Suman. I'm a technologist, but I don't understand much of biotechnology. The other day we have a scholar from New Jersey. I requested him to give us a talk on biotechnology. What he said went over the head of everyone. No, what you said was in layman's language. To the point which I'm making today, the whole world, technology has taken control. It's out of the control of politicians' hands. And we must know how to control technology. Now, who will control? If you leave it to the hands of the politicians, the world may end up in disaster. If you leave it in the hand of technologists, it will be a worse disaster. So who is going to control that technology? We need a new brand of people who understand economics and technology. A friend of mine asked me, what is technology? I said, that's a very difficult question. It is science, it is engineering, plus something more. And that is your social objectives. So I wouldn't take much time, but I'm not afraid of globalization. I'm afraid of free market, but I'm not afraid of globalization. The other day I was talking to the Chief Justice of Patna High Court, and I was telling that the whole world is changing. There's an explosion of knowledge, but your laws are not changing. He said, what do you mean? I said, from a satellite, they can pick up a tin on the Makama fridge. So where is your privacy anymore? So when we talk of privacy, there's no privacy. And maybe they will pick up our whispers also. So having said that, I congratulate ADRI for having organized this seminar and look forward to many more such seminars, but not covering the whole world. Let us stick to one subject for a day, and not so long a day. We have old people here. I think we should finish by 5 o'clock. Thank you very much.
You talked about globalization and international trade regimes, multilateral trade regimes, and even Mr. Dunkel has been mentioned off and on. Now, there is the fact that an international multilateral trade regime exists, and although the Uruguay round has not yet been finalized, discussions are going on. Mr. Dunkel has produced a draft on which different countries are expressing their opinions in different ways. However, one thing that did not come out at all in the discussion was unilateral action taken by certain countries. And in this particular case, I would like to name a special 301 section of the US Trade Act, under which India is likely to be penalized by the 26th of February, well before Mr. Dunkel's deadline of 17th April comes about. Now, this is the right now the technical legal position that the United States has launched an investigation against India on the issue of trade-related intellectual property rights, and under its law, the U.S. Trade Representative is required to invite public opinion, which includes, of course, the opinion of U.S. pharmaceuticals industry, on whether action should be taken against India. And the public has been given up to 24th February to come up with this opinion. After which, between 24th and 26th, Mrs. Carlyle makes up her mind and announces one way or the other whether India is going to be penalized or not. Now, this, mind you, is well before Mr. Dunkel ever gets around to finalizing his Uruguay round, if at all he does. Now, the question which I want to ask is, it's twofold. It's almost like a riddle or a puzzle. What happens if Carlyle takes action against India? Does it make multilateral trade organization irrelevant? What happens if Carlyle does not take action against India? Does it mean that there has been some negotiation quietly done in the meanwhile, where it's not only the politics of trade which has acted, but the politics perhaps of diplomatic recognitions and so on, which might have acted, which will mean that this action on the TRIPS issue does not need to be taken. In which case, is the US public being fooled up to the 24th of February? So who is being fooled? Is it Mr. Dunkel being fooled, the US public being fooled, or the Indian public being fooled? This is the question which I want to ask.
Who will answer it?
Especially in sugar. US would no longer feel it necessary to have its Trade and Competitiveness Act, and therefore to invoke 301 super and special. Now, it is for India to judge whether we would have been better off dealing with the United States bilaterally or acceding to local text and abiding by the dispute settlement mechanism in that text, under which action like that now being taken with 301 will come. That will take us very far afield in the discussion. But briefly, so far as one aspect of the question. Now, why Mrs. Hills is still maintaining this procedure when what is included in Dunkel draft should be satisfactory to her is because nobody at this stage can take the Dunkel draft for granted. And so a little bit of pressure at this moment is not something which is totally unexpected. The last speaker is Dr. Samantha.
That is that there would have to be a great deal more equality and homogeneity in the package than would appear to be the case. There are just two things that strike me which I'd like to mention. One is that whereas what is being demanded is the movement of capital, what is being denied is the movement of labor. So if we had to open up to capital, then our labor must be allowed to move. You cannot have it, I want my capital in, you keep your labor out. Therefore, if capital comes in, then green cards and visas, etc. must be done away with, because this is totality. The other point that I'd like to mention is demanding market access and withholding technology. This is not an equitable situation either. If you want market access, there must be some binding of giving over technology as well. So these are some of the very, very basic inequalities and heterogeneous couplings that are present in the liberalization, globalization package, which would appear to be firstly unfair, but also areas which can be dealt with and negotiated. I mean, if we are forced, for whatever reason, to deal with capital transfer, then we can also negotiate strongly for labor movement.
Well, now I move on to the second subject for discussion this afternoon, which is market planning in the state. And if we are going to have even 20 minutes discussion after the second and the third subject, then the speakers will have to confine their presentation to 20 minutes each, which will be about an hour. And then we will be left with another 20 minutes for discussion from the floor. So I would urge the three speakers, two on the first subject and the third one on the subject that will come up later, to confine their presentations to 20 minutes. Now, I will request Dr. Arun Kumar to present his paper.
Chairman and friends, I'm kind of a peripheral person for pure economic discussion because my area of interest is sociology of development, much more with reference to peripheral capitalist societies or the societies which are integrated in the world economy through colonial apparatus. So for me, it's the news that we are about to enter a phase of globalization or integration in the world economy. And I think that the issue is fairly settled in the literature in social sciences, maybe not in the international diplomacy. But still, I take it as a very positive development that the countries which were integrated in the world system through colonial linkages and who had become overtly state-centric, be it an authoritarian model or a democratic model, i.e. planning, are discovering the virtues of markets. But at the conceptual level, for me, market and state are two arms available to a society and also therefore to a nation state for its agenda. Over-reliance upon any one of them hurts the nation state, be it India or United States of America or Japan. I also want to make a submission that the Japanese option or the Japanese path has been a mirage to Indian intelligentsia as well as political elite since late 1800s. If we look at the critique of colonial economic policy, of people ranging from Dadabhai Nauroji to Mahatma Gandhi as an option available to Indian people, particularly Indian capital. We always thought of Japanese possibility, the famous samurai spirit of Gandhiji to defend his trusteeship, and even in post-colonial times, the national plan of Indian entrepreneurial class argued for a Japanese possibility where there will be a benign guidance of the state without really much of an interference. So, sir, today, if we are rediscovering the virtues of market, when the state has failed in a way after 8 successive plans to meet the imperatives of nation building in case of India, and to meet the imperatives of nation-state maintenance itself in most of the post-colonial societies, I think it's a part of the decolonization which is an overdue intellectual process. Secondly, for me, the society today, if it's having a new look at the market, it is an effort to move away from state-centric political economy and state-centric political sociology, where the state becomes an axiom, Euclid's point, with all the virtues possible for collective conscience. It is recognizing the defects in the state apparatus and getting away from that attention and the affection for our own construction, that is becoming a little away, moving away from our own baby, that is post-colonial state structure. Now, beyond that, I like to argue that if magic of the market is being presented and is being shopped around these days, and if there is a new vigor behind the arguments after the collapse of Soviet Union and defeat of Mr. Gaddafi, then the whole emphasis is misplaced. Because for most of the countries of the third world, the impact of Soviet Union's collapse and defeat of Mr. Gaddafi are rather non-events. No one will better know about it than India herself. Mr. Gaddafi has been on the other side of the fence in terms of our defense imperatives. And Soviet Union has been moving away and away from that glorious experience of 1966 when they rescued us in face of the crisis of year 40. So we have been brought to realities of the day with certain shock which we received in July 1991, June-July period, and that shock has created an atmosphere which is congenial for restoring the balance between the use of two vital arms available to our nation state or any nation state in post-colonial societies, that is one arm of the state and the other one of the market. India has been also painted as a caged tiger, as if our mission, our destiny is to become a tiger in this jungle of nation states and grab here and eat there and attack there. No, I think India is more like a wounded civilization, and it requires more internal cures than this proposal of outward-looking effort. Yes, trade can become a great catalyst for the total process, but it cannot be a new engine for our progress. The progressive momentum has to be generated by looking at a specific context. And I need not repeat that India is a society which is fractured, an economy which is unevenly developed, and a polity which has become highly unstable. Now, given these three dimensions of our society, our polity, and our economy, what will be the magic which market brings to us? I do not rule out the possibility of many reforms. But those reforms will be in political economy with respect to the role of the state which has been there in last 30-35 years. The patronage offered by the Indian state, which Shri Kamla Prasad pointed out as wrong kind of liberalization, that can be corrected. The continuity of missing opportunities
for which we don't have the wherewithal in the conceptual sense, but in objective terms we do have it. I heard Shri Mushkun Dubey is telling us that since 1980 we have been denied the resources to make a dent in this emerging community called European Common Market via various bridges which we had built seriously through our foreign policy efforts, Portugal or East European countries. Now, at the analytical level from the finance ministry there is really no resource. But in objective terms, there are possibilities and the possibilities have been pointed out. Our defense apparatus, the holy cow, which no one can dare to touch if one wants to win the elections next time. The lobby called black money lobby, for which we every day hear, even now on television and radio, that you come and give your money, no questions asked. In fact, you will get better deal. You can, if you want, channel it through NRI contact. Now, this kind of a very pathetic situation demands an internal pathology rather than looking for a new magic wand called the market or getting into global trade. Because after all, market has certain imperatives. What are these imperatives? Market as a concept requires a situation of exchange. What are we going to exchange? I think we have read too much in the newspapers about the emergence of unipolar world. Those who really deal with the political economy realities try to tell us that it's a quadrupolar situation. It's no more unipolar. There are 4 blocks of nation states emerging. One under the defense umbrella of the United States of America. The other under the leadership of the German capital, which has convergences as well as divergences with the United States strategy. The third, in and around Southeast Asia and East Asia, under Japan. And the fourth, which we are ignoring today, but tomorrow we may find that a serious proposition emerging around something called Russia. Now, it's a quadrupolar situation. And there, countries like India have very little to offer except what Dr. Sahai pointed out, our human resources. We can have a number of people received in terms of very skilled labor, right from Abu Dhabi to New York and Perth and Bonn. But in terms of our manufactured goods, value-added material, I think we don't need any better testimony than what we heard from someone coming from really the top, Shri Mushkun Dubey this morning. Market means first managing investment. From investment, then we have some kind of a production. From production, then we have to go for price regime. From price regime, then we move for some kind of a tax system, capital accumulation process, which will take us towards employment. And all this requires some collective structure, which has some legitimacy, i.e. the state. And sir, our state has lost a lot of its legitimacy in last 15 years. Therefore, even market construction will require, market maintenance will require some kind of an effective state apparatus. We have been moving from a situation of state-sponsored market to a craving for state-free market. What is the ultimate meaning of a state-free market? The meaning is that it can be upheld by classes. And everybody is looking with a lot of promise from this category of 150 million Indians, the Maruti Indians, or the Indians who have moved up since our post-colonial reforms. And it's a viable category for a lot of countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, even probably for Korea, but not for a giant like India. And there is a demand and there is a debate that the state has done a lot of nonsense and now it should be given over, the market management should be given over to the classes. And the classes will determine, they will work it out, they'll fight it out, they'll rough it out as they say in jargon terms, and then they determine a most efficient, effective management of the market, which will ultimately have a bearing upon our resources, which will ultimately have an impact upon our accumulation level, and it will bring affluence. Poverty will be removed.
I think this class is one of those characters in human history who are like spoiled children, for whom the parents did their best, but after they made it, they started ignoring the needs of other lesser fortunate children of the same family. Moved out, became NRI, and started sending birthday greetings and all, but ignoring the requirements of house maintenance, feeding the other people, taking care of marriage problems of sisters, etc., etc. This education, functional literacy, etc., etc. I think people in Delhi and Bombay will be very unhappy, but people of India in general will be happy a lot. But the state can't move out of it. You just try your luck with DTC, privatize it, try your luck with double roti system of our morning breakfast. I think we are in a situation where it's a great paradox. There's an urge for reform, but of the wrong kind. I believe that we need a situation where a new kind of state market nexus, i.e. continuity of mixed economy, where there is a strong private sector, but equally strong state. The command should not be taken away from the hands of the state, because that's the last hope. If Indian state moves out of its legitimacy imperatives, that fear of vote, no matter how corrupt the whole electoral process is, I think will become a case fit for limited democracy. And you see the articulation. I see some of the recent books in political sociology who are saying that India has too much of democracy. And that creates a lot of discontent. And that discontent can't be controlled by the state. So the state is all the time busy fighting out these expressions of discontent. So where's the time for development? Resources are rediverted. So what we need really is limited democracy. Now that kind of diagnosis will start coming, sir. And the class which will enjoy that kind of limited democracy will be having 101 arguments beyond Adam Smith and my professor of University of Chicago, Milton Friedman. But today, if you look at the imperatives of Indian nation state, moving towards a free market situation will create an India which has become practically a problem for free operation of market forces. India will go for some kind of a balkanization, some kind of a federalization of the wrong kind. Because today it is all held together through a democratic process, which is comfortable for certain people and uncomfortable for certain other people. And a lot of people want to move out of this collectivity called India. So if we remove that benign guiding spirit called state, which is one expression of our identity, and move exclusively towards the direction of market, I think rationality of market says that Kashmir and Punjab and Assam, and if Kaveri waters are not solved, then Tamil Nadu and Karnataka should be having their own economic autonomy. Mr. Biju Patnaik has articulated it very well. When he says that, we can attract entrepreneurs, but they run away because to come to Orissa, they have to come via Calcutta or via Bombay. And you never know what is happening in Calcutta and Bombay. I can ensure about Orissa, but not about Calcutta, Bombay and Delhi. Now, are we prepared for that kind of a thing? No, I think that subaltern masses have just started enjoying the advantages of democracy, have just started twisting the arms of the state for their advantages and against their disadvantages. They may not resist as it is going on in Burma, but they will not be integrated, they will be eliminated. And is it the right way to go for some kind of a nation building? I think there are a lot of problems in such a situation. Yes, I requested Dubeyji that when there are 15 minutes over, give me 5 minutes advance notice so that I can just wrap it up quickly. To come to the problem, central problem, which is there even for a sane world, war-free world, as Jhaji was trying to argue. What we need is a human society composed of several units which are self-reliant and interdependent.
not interdependent, but some of them autonomous and others are dependent. Because you create a miserable world. That was the world before 1945. Two of the continents were appendaged to one great empire, and they used to say it's white man's burden. You know, I want to take out that racist sting out of it. But yes, there were books, and the books are still taught all over America, that Asia and African colonies were white man's burden. That kind of a situation is still there because these countries, after getting liberated, have not done much in terms of creating even development imperatives. And there we can use market forces to minimize the unholy relationship between those who thrive upon the market forces and those who thrive upon the state forces, i.e. the political elite and the entrepreneurial classes of the post-colonial society. Both of them have entered an unholy alliance under the garb of nation building through the processes called planning and whatnot, and nobody has the internal strength, and there I think we can utilize the global pressure, the global thrust, to de-link these two who have been growing symbiotically. And here, I think there can be a conception of a triangle where state, society, and market, these are 3 points of a dynamic triangle, where all the three are informed by the requirements of all the three. Our society has not completed its civilizational process, which was interrupted in last 200 years. That has to be also taken into account. And because of that interruption, sir, nearly 2/3 of our people are outside this market mechanism. They are so-called people either below poverty line or just at the survival level. What will be their role? What will be advantages to them? As somebody pointed out, Green Revolution was a beautiful idea. Helped the whole country, but didn't help the farmers who had less than economic holding. Farmers who were in the unirrigated area. And I don't have to labor this point in a place like Patna and a province like Bihar. And here, if we have that kind of a purpose, I think market, which has been an ignored capacity of our society, can be utilized, but we should not really go by the new definition of the situation, that a new what you call area-free, ethnicity-free, class-free globalization is taking place through internationalization of market. I think there are many, many biases built within this new campaign, and those biases can again be registered. And because, obviously there is interdependence and growing interdependence. So our bargaining capacity or our capacity to modulate or moderate is greater than what it was in 1920s and 30s. And there, some kind of judicious, approach, not really going by this imperialist bogey, neither going by nationalist bogey, we can have, a civilizational agenda in front of us, and then approach various propositions coming from Carla Hills as well as Ratan Tata. Thank you very much.
Science, technology, engineering, environment, and economic issues. I think
elaborate more on politics and political economy, but the environment is also included in that. I'm going to sort of cover a fairly wide compass, but fairly superficially. Concentrate on a couple of issues which I think are important. Let me start by telling you a little episode concerning a particular firm known as Moody's. These are investment bankers and financial consultants who are in the same category as Standard & Poor, and whose rating of different countries and different companies counts for a lot in terms of their creditworthiness, the decisions of the banking system in the world as a whole, the commercial banking system, to invest or to lend to these countries, or very major investors to decide whether a singular company is worth buying. Now, Moody's produced two very interesting reports on India, both last year. One in August, which in some sense was absolutely critical to the sort of the emergence of a consensus within the banking system in the world that India was no longer creditworthy. This was in August, July-August 1991. In December again, Moody's produced a second report on India, which has since been analyzed. Less than a month ago, the Economic Times carried an outstanding piece dissecting that report. So I'm not going to summarize it, but all I'll say is that although there's been considerable improvement in the economy, certainly, for instance, in the foreign exchange reserves of the government of India, which had risen as a result of fresh induction of loans, Moody's continued to maintain the same -2B rating. Now, this particular report, this particular analysis in the Economic Times should lead to at least half a dozen people on the Moody's staff being sacked, because there are factual errors which are so gross, whether it's in terms of ratios of debt to GDP, the debt servicing ratio, or even the total debt of the government of India, public debt of the government of India, and so on and so forth. So elementary errors like this. Why I'm mentioning this is that if Moody's and Standard & Poor's are the basis on which the world investing community, the world banking system makes decisions, these are supposed to be the market leaders. These are supposed to be, then obviously there's something deeply disturbingly wrong. Okay? What is wrong is precisely what we're going to talk about. And I think what is wrong is essentially that in the concept of the market, we are confusing a symptom with causes, and then ending up with totally disastrous conclusions as to what kind of, what we mean by a free market and how important it is for us to change our whole approach to development, the development strategy, by reorienting towards the market. So let me start with a few simple propositions. One is that some of the most momentous decisions in the world economy as it is actually run, or even in most national economies, large and small, as they're actually manipulated, administered, guided, call what you will, are essentially non-economic, they're political, they're arbitrary, they're cultural. They have very little to do with so-called objective, impersonal criteria that are supposed to be contained in the market. Now, why is this the case? It's the case basically because markets, unlike what we are told in the textbook, which are meant to be equal, based on perfect competition, on the availability of all that there is to know, and so on and so forth, are in reality totally imperfect. What tends to happen, in fact, is that competition gets managed, prices get organized, rigged, arranged, and rates of interest, rates of exchange, i.e. key variables that make a great deal of difference to prices, to demand, supply, and movements of capital, and so on, tend to be resolved on the basis of fundamentally arbitrary decisions in the real world. I cannot, for instance, see how you can have 3 or 4 different rates of exchange between the ruble and the dollar, unless there is in fact some kind of a tacit understanding between various dealers in these currencies to organize those rates and to maintain them for long periods of time. If this is the case, then we really must look at the question of managed trade in large terms. Are you talking about managed competition or arranged prices? In such situations, all the conditions, including Pareto optimality, including efficient flows of investment and so on, will not obtain. In other words, there is absolutely no reason to believe that a market-driven system, even if it could be created, would be any more efficient than another one which runs on the basis of a different criteria, about which we will talk later. So if you're really talking about the whole question of allocating resources through the market, we must recognize two things: that there is nothing particularly efficient about them. Secondly, that even if over a short period of time there is in fact a true determination of the most optimal conditions of investment and resource allocation, even then the whole history of capitalism tells us that there is periodic recession, depression, and periodic destruction of actual productive resources. That this is not accidental, that this is not something that can be overcome through various state measures and so on, that there is a fundamental tendency within market-driven economies, within capitalism, to concentrate and misallocate resources, which over a period of time get corrected, if you like, through recessions, through depressions, and through very, very bad cyclical downturns that involve enormous damage and loss of actual productive resources of society, and hardships to very large numbers of people. So in fact, we ought to see the whole question of the market in terms of some of these limitations. It's very important also to see that, in fact, there is nothing contrary to what we are told about the great virtues of the market. In the real world, the markets tend to hide true relationships between human beings, different categories of economic agents. And yet, the ideologues of the market often demand that they must be given a very privileged position. For the simple reason, as Suman was saying earlier, that there is nothing particularly more sacred about capital being internationalized if labor is not to be internationalized. There is no prior reason why capital flows should know no national boundaries, but the movement of labor should be restricted. Similarly, there is no particular reason why the market should come before any other determinant of economic activity. There is absolutely no reason, either philosophically or socially or practically, to believe that the market has that kind of priority, either in human activity, in history, or in terms of its particular importance to large numbers of people. For instance, there's no reason to believe that many people would want to give up, unless they were forced to in some ways, give up their own culture or language any more than they would like to give up their economic sovereignty or economic independence. It's just that, in some sense, the market, when presented as an inevitable fait accompli, that people can be persuaded to say, okay, well, there it is, we have to deal with it. But there is no particular reason why you have to deal with it, which is ab initio, and which is given to us in advance. Let me now come to the problems that I think that an over-reliance on the market would actually entail. I'll talk first more generally, and secondly then about India in particular. I think first, the market privileges the entrepreneur over and above other economic agents such as producers, consumers, the larger society, and so on and so forth. I think the experience of entrepreneurship that such as we have in this country, and for that matter, in most parts of the world, has not been particularly uniform or happy one. For instance, in India, the same entrepreneurs whom we are meant to now support as our saviors have run something like 200,000, 220,000 industrial factories aground. They've turned them sick. The same entrepreneurs who are subsidized to the extent of something like 70,000 crores rupees, which have been locked up in bank finance to these so-called sick units, are the ones who milk them dry. In fact, there's hardly a project that comes up in which the promoter does not recover his initial investment even before the plant is actually erected. I mean, if this is the situation, I think the sort of naive faith we have in the qualities of entrepreneurship should be subjected to questioning. In fact, I would argue that precisely because the market privileges the entrepreneur, that you have a whole set of conditions of industrial sickness given in advance. But let me talk about something else now, which is the general question of market failure. In fact, the whole, if you like, science, the technical side of economics has evolved over the past century, and particularly after the Depression, the Great Depression of the 30s, has sought to deal with the phenomenon of market failure. In fact, market failure rather than market success is what has driven a whole number of thinkers to devise strategies to cope with this phenomenon. And therefore, in fact, what we are dealing with is the implicit acknowledgement that markets, in fact, are prone to fail, and therefore it is the job of some agency in society, whether it's the state or some other organization, to prevent this failure, and to, if that is not possible, to at least cushion large numbers of people from the effects of this failure. So whether you're talking about the poor, or you're talking about minimum needs, you're talking about unemployment as a result of market failure, these become some of the biggest priorities in all public policy initiatives that have been undertaken. This wouldn't happen if, as I said, market failure were not a very major phenomenon. In the Indian case, the question is even more sharply posed, precisely because you don't even have market failure, you have just the simple exclusion of very large numbers of people from the market altogether. Precisely because the poor do not have access to the market, that you have to think of means of actually creating some notion of redistribution of society's product, gross product, so that their minimum needs are met. But even in societies where you do have some notion of access, you find that markets have failed. That's precisely why people like Professor Pigou developed a whole system of a whole theory of public goods and ways of reaching them to the underprivileged, even of more developed societies. Now, let me just deal with the general notion that is gained a great deal of popularity, which is that much of the development of the third world that has taken place, especially the NICs and the Asian tigers, has taken place because they have followed the logic of the free market. In fact, I think this is the biggest myth that we have ever been fed. The truth is that the Asian tigers, like Japan, are distinguished by their fight against the market. In fact, probably the best book on the subject is appropriately entitled Against the Market. The whole strategy employed in these countries was to defy some of the pressures of the market by relying upon the state and upon some of the historical advantages that they have. Let me just summarize what I think are some of the major factors that are common to the Asian tigers case, and which would make which in fact were quite crucial to their rapid industrialization. First and foremost, these are societies which immediately after the Second World War, undertook land reform on a massive scale. Two, because they were part of a virtual United States protectorate region, they didn't have to incur high defense expenditures. Three, because they were part again of a political alliance, they were given access in the early days, especially the days of the Korean War, made a big difference to Japan. And similarly, later in the Vietnam War, some of the Asian tigers were given access which would have been politically very difficult to establish for a non-aligned country or a non-aligned bloc of nations. Fourth, and very important, the overwhelming agency in these societies which undertook any kind of political and economic reform was the state, and not the individual private entrepreneur. Fifth, very important, the mode of state intervention was extremely specific, directed at particular product lines and capturing certain markets in a very selective, extremely discriminate fashion, not on the basis of a general ideological approach of freeing trade or allowing large volumes of investment to come in at all. Sixth, and this is very important, it involved a great deal of protectionism. In fact, whether it's Japan or South Korea, let's forget the idea that you can invest in Japan. Japan is one of the most tightly regulated economies of the world. Even today, to get a 10% stake in a Japanese firm in Japan is virtually impossible, unless there is a large deal involved, which the Japanese government and the MITI would judge to be in their interest. Similarly, in South Korea, it's very, very difficult for any kind of foreign capital to find entry. Eighth, this is again a very important thing. Most of these regimes, while have only democratized rather recently, and that too very superficially, they had a very long period of extremely brutal, despotic forms of rule under which they would discipline the workforce, abolish trade unions or suppress trade union activity in a big way, brutalize large numbers of their people. And it's only now that you find that some of them could afford to open up politically. And what are the effects? In South Korea, you have a working class explosion, which is quite similar to the Europe of the late 19th century or the early 20th century. It's that kind of fantastic amount of working class militancy. So these are not societies which have coped with some of the problems that a democratic country, a large country, has. Ninth, they've been traditionally very homogeneous societies, very small culturally, in terms of religion, in terms of class, not as differentiated as most large countries of the world, including certainly India. And finally, I would say, over the 80s, they've shown a great deal of egalitarianism in the way they have redistributed incomes, which has increased the legitimacy of the demand the state often places upon their people for sacrifices for the present in order that gains are made in the future. Finally, I think if we evaluate the real social and environmental costs of this industrialization, they turn out to be very high. Anyway, the point is that none of this, I think, all of this established, I think that there's the whole idea of relying on the market as the key to industrialization is simply a fake proposition. Even if you're talking about the so-called developed countries which were industrially advanced even before the World War, you have a similar feature, a similar phenomenon. They had historical advantages in the form of colonies, or they had a great deal of access to natural resources, and some certain very, very specific, unique historical conditions which we can't go into now. But it is not through the market that any country that I know of has industrialized in any way. Incidentally, here it's very important to mention that the United States itself has a very, very interesting history of its economic development. Today, of course, the government of the U.S. takes a very moral stand against, for instance, default. But the United States used default on its loans as an actual strategy in the 19th century. It developed it into an art. And I dare say that it would have been impossible for America to have registered very high rates of growth in that part of its past without using extremely unconventional means that defy the logic of the market. Anyway, finally, I'd just like to make 2 or 3 quick points. One is that there has been a certain historical evolution of the notion of the ideology of the free market, and I think we should be aware of where it is at and where it came from and where it's going. I think there was we can trace the phenomenon to the late 70s and the early 80s, especially in the United States and Britain. Living out of control, should it not be part of our agenda to bring them back under control, under social control? I'm not talking about state control or bureaucratic control. I'm not talking about having clever men and wise men deciding to develop new forms of regulation. I'm talking about some notion of social control to which they are subject. And I see this phenomenon as extremely ominous, if only because it means that we are being asked to put the market not just above welfare, but above democracy itself, and I think that is bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to the last subject we discussed this afternoon, which is market and economic theory. And we will have a presentation on it by Mr. Sudhanshu Bhushan. He is the chairman of the seminar committee of ADRI and faculty member of Patna University. He has presented the longest paper, and I sincerely hope that he can summarize it in 20 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm aware that it would be catastrophic if I begin my theoretical discourse at the end of the seminar. So, I'd like to summarize it probably in 30 minutes time. So, my original idea was to summarize the whole article in 4 sections. First, to deal with markets in neoclassical economic theory. Secondly, in section 2, I intended to discuss markets in classical political economy and what role the real market, as opposed to the computer analog view of the market in neoclassical theory, have in classical political economy. And by classical political economy, I mean as an analytical system of thought, rather than as a history of economic thought. And I also mean that there was analytical divide during 1870 between classical and neoclassical systems of thought. So basically in these 2 sections, I am dealing with markets in neoclassical theory, because it is quite often suggested that markets promote efficiency. And to use Lord Robinson's famous phrase, market is an efficient allocator of scarce resources. Now, in particular neoclassical theoretical construct, what is the meaning of the resource allocational role of the market? This is to be understood. It is also said that market means, or free market means, the freedom of individual entrepreneurs. So it is also important to look at the role of individuals in neoclassical theory, as well as, of course, in classical theory, which I am presenting as an alternative system of thought to the neoclassical system of thought. It is also important to look at, since it is subjective, that free market promotes competition. So it is also important to look at what is the meaning and what is the content of competition in neoclassical system of thought and in classical system of thought. And for this, I am afraid I will have to go into the detailed structure of the whole neoclassical and the classical system of thought, which I cannot summarize in 20 minutes time. But nevertheless, I would like to be as precise, as brief as possible. Market in neoclassical theory has a specific meaning. This is to be understood. And market is the exclusive domain of action in neoclassical and in neoclassical economy. And the relative price guided substitution, that is, and every individual responds in relation to changes in the relative price, whether it is the prices of practice services, whether it is the prices of commodities. So market and prices. Market is the exclusive domain, exclusive area, and relative price changes are changes in response to which an individual makes an adjustment to changes in quantity. That means an individual decides with respect to commodities to be demanded, commodities to be supplied, factor quantities to be demanded, and factor quantities to be supplied. Now, looking into the structure of the neoclassical theory, individual is the unit of analysis in this theoretical construct. An individual is a rational, atomistic individual. And economy is supposed to be an aggregate of the atomistic, rational individual. The whole besides an individual, I am talking of a specific notion of market and the individual in this classical, in this neoclassical social construct. This individual is supposed to have the full information of market, of the prices prevailing, the technology prevailing, and he is also supposed to have an equal access to the technology. So an individual is treated in this theoretical framework in a symmetric way. No asymmetry is allowed to have a role to play in this neoclassical social construct, from which, in fact, we draw all inspiration towards free market, liberalization, opening up economies, and so on and so forth. Economy is divided into two sets, producers and consumers. And the individual change and choice theoretical framework is supposed to generate an individual aggregate demand and supply function. So the principle of substitution. And this then is summed up simply by way of summation, simple summation, mathematical summation, into an aggregate demand and supply function. And if well-behaved demand and supply functions exist, then we say that there is equilibrium in the market. That equilibrium prices and quantities are determined. And only then can we say that market plays the role of an efficient indicator. So in this neoclassical economic theory, determination of equilibrium prices and quantities basically depends upon the well-behavedness of the demand and supply function. This well-behavedness of the demand and supply functions depends upon the way individuals change in choice theoretic framework is supposed to work. And it's supposed to work under certain very restrictive assumptions. Let us see what those assumptions are and whether those assumptions are really actually fulfilled in the market. If it is not, then the whole notion of free market, the laissez-faire economy, may fall to the ground. It may not, if it doesn't succeed in actual practice, and I have other criticism also which relate to the logic of the whole new cluster theory, that even within its own structural framework of the new cluster theory, there are some logical problems, which we have pointed out the Saraswat, which may not generate well-behaved demand and supply functions, and therefore market cannot play the role of an efficient electric system as it is. So, an individual as a producer, first of all, the individual as a producer, an individual as a producer is given a convex set of inputs and outputs. What does this basically mean? It basically means that you do not allow increasing returns to a scale. Increasing returns to a scale is simply assumed. A technology is given, and each and every individual, whether it is Birla or whether it is a young entrepreneur, is supposed to have an equal access to this technology. Granted this, it is said that if the prices of factor services and commodities are given, then an individual as a producer maximizes profit, and in the process of maximizing profit it generates certain well-behaved demand and supply. A producer generates falling demand functions of factor services and upward rising supply functions of commodities. Similarly, and in this decision, a producer is not influenced by externalities. Externalities in production, therefore, is completely ruled out. And how unrealistic this is can be imagined, because economies of the scale are a dictator. Similarly, individual as a consumer is given a convex set of commodities bundle out of which it has to choose. Given preference ordering and given the prices of all the commodities and factor services, in the process of maximizing the utility, a rational individual and consumer is again supposed to behave nicely through the inputs of production, so that it generates downward falling downward demand functions of commodities and upward rising supply functions of factor. Then this is aggregated and the equilibrium condition is summarized by the proponents of neoclassical economics, Walter. In terms of the condition that sum of active demands in each market must be 0. And if n minus 1 is market clear, then the market for the numeraire commodity, that is nth market. Now, we have seen that in this I'm very technical, and I did not realize the limitations of the fact that there are various non-economics also. But since I presented this in this format, in this theoretical framework, I'd like to spell out certain technicalities involved with this presentation. I'm extremely sorry for that. But basically what I mean to say is that the whole philosophy of laissez-faire, the whole philosophy of free market economy is guided by, and even I may dare to say that the whole new policy package, philosophy behind this new policy package is this neoclassical system of economic thought. And what I am saying is that what are the restrictive structural framework of this neoclassical system of thought, where the concept of market is highly myopic, the concept of market does not allow the externalities in consumption and production. Concept of individual as rational atomistic individual is highly unrealistic assumption that each and every individual does not have a free access to market, doesn't have a free access to technology, doesn't have the free access or free flow of information of all sorts, and therefore, particularly in a situation where individual is asymmetric in terms of being a member of class, caste, ethnic group, an individual does not respond in a symmetric way as is shown in this new lecture. This is what, but this is an argument based on some unrealistic assumptions. But the fundamental criticism, as pointed out by Tarafa, is that there can't be well-behaved demand and supply functions to determine equilibrium. Meaning thereby that he raises doubts from the production function side, and he says that the demand function for capital cannot be monotonic downward function. And this in a general equilibrium system of volume means that we cannot have other demand and supply of factor services and commodities. And this is basically in spite of the rigorous logical claim of neoclassical theory that seems logically consistent. The fact is that Tarafa challenged the theory on the grounds of it being logically inconsistent. But this is basically the criticism of the general concept. Tarafa, as early as in 25 Italian and 26 English articles, had also pointed out that because of the increasing economic scale and economies of the scale, in a partial equilibrium framework as given by Marshall, there can't be an upward rising supply because of the economies of the scale again, and because of the reversibility in production. And therefore, the partial equilibrium approach is inconsistent wherever economic scale. Lastly, I may add that it is also so, all that I have established that in neoclassical system of thought, the concept of free market that is supposed to generate or supposed to efficiently allocate the resources, so much talk about efficiency of the market, is logically wrong. It is wrong also on the grounds of being unrealistic. Second, that the concept of individual, an individual who is autonomous in taking decisions, an individual who acts symmetrically, etc., is wrong. Therefore, this also doesn't hold. Thirdly, that it promotes competition. Probably is also wrong. Because in various classical writers, like Adam Smith, in book 1, chapter 1 to 3 of the lessons, while he is talking of division of labor, also Karl Marx and Alien Young in his economic journal later, they talk about economies of scale. And these economies of scale will necessarily lead to monopoly. And in fact, this was the point raised by Tarafa, after which Mr. John Robinson developed a theory of, and Chamberlain developed their theories on imperfect competition. So, moving away from competition, from free competition, to imperfect competition, that is monopolies and the behavior of monopolies, is basically due to the fact that free market may, through economies of scale, lead to the generation of monopoly, and Therefore, it may not promote competitive conditions. So much is being said about it, or this, I think, is wrong. But then this doesn't mean that I am against market. I am differentiating between a computer analog view of the market as conceptualized within neoclassical. But there is also the concept of market or real market within classical terms, which I claim it to be an analytical thought in the writings of Physiocrat and Marx. Now, what is the concept of prices of the market, the role of individuals, the role of competition in this cluster? That will, I do not know how many.
5 minutes.
5 minutes I have left. Sorry. In fact, and this shows also a strong apathy, if not hostility, towards the political discourses, that political discourses are allowed to take place at the last moment when we feel so fatigued. And we are not ready to listen, and nor am I in a position to.
So listening to you, I can very well see a scope for compression. Because I don't even know what Mr. Robinson did.
Market in resource creation and the role of market in capital accumulation. And while the determination of natural price is inconsistent with the distribution of surplus products in accordance with the competitive conditions of uniform wages and the rate. So, the role of natural price determination that is taking place in the sphere of exchange, in the sphere of market, in the sphere of circulation of commodities, is basically to provide a consistent set of prices to be consistent with the distribution in accordance with the competitive conditions of uniform wages and rate. Secondly, Adam Smith as well as Marx also talk about the fact that let us not be guided by the criticism of commodities. That is to say, the relation manifested between the systems of exchange, between commodities. And the central message is that behind the forces of market, behind the sphere of exchange, we should go into the material forces of the system. We should try to understand what the labor process is, how labor process could be really made an instrument of change, how production process, instead of placing emphasis on market, instead of placing emphasis on the sphere of exchange, how and commodity-centered approach in neoclassical impulses to grow. And this dialectical interaction between market and the production process is therefore called for and is emphasized by the classical writers. I think there was a lack of time. I will not go into section 3 where I am dealing with the political economy of the Indian state. Why, after all, the need of the state was felt at the time of industrialization? Because, to put it very briefly, industrial bourgeoisie at that time and the rural kulaks, they were highly insecure because of the previous processes of commercialization of agriculture and the destruction of home market of the Indian manufacturing sector and the decline of handicraft. So they needed a very strong state intervention. And state intervention, therefore, at the time of independence was following. Those who argue that free market, only through the instruments of free market, and those who argue that India had already begun with some sort of an inward-looking strategy, some sort of export pessimism, do not realize that how a state, how import substitution, etc., was so important to develop ourselves on our and to provide, in fact, protection, a sense of security
2-hour industrial market, 2-hour industrial bourgeoisie or the rural or the agricultural sector and farm. Besides, many developmental theorists also were favoring capital-intensive principles of industrialization, and therefore the role of the state was very important in that process. On grounds of ideology, of course, you could say that the state was supposed to reflect the interest of the masses. It was supposed to transcend the narrow sectarian interests, class, caste, etc. And therefore, one should not doubt the role of the state as a signal in economic development since industrialization. But to my mind, I think because of certain, I've dealt with some other issues like the autonomy of the state being taken away in the process of our industrialization process. And there are various studies which do talk about the autonomy of the state being taken away because of the various coalitions of forces or interests working and supporting a state, or a state being supported by these coalitions. And this basically, the passion for free market today is nothing to my mind, is the frustration against the state management. That the state too also has alienated the entrepreneurs. That the state too could not promote the large entrepreneurial base. And therefore we are in a dilemma today that we talk about the free market as the only solution against the prevailing state failure now. This being the topic of the third question, I said some broad perspective of change and the role of, basically I have said that the role of the state intervention is absolutely essential, even in order to promote competition, even in order to promote free market. Secondly, I have said that the role of institutions, whether it is a building a box, educational institution, or other local level institutions, voluntary organizations, is also important because of the growing dissatisfaction of the market and the state that we are doing. Because market is also liable to failure. There is a strong sense of dissatisfaction with the state. So I think institutions also could play a very large role in overall economic reform. And in particular, the role of cooperatives in agriculture is also extremely important. With these perceptions, I have not been able to really go into detail. But with these perceptions, I just end up. And I'm sorry for being a bit theoretical and causing some convenience to the audience and probably being redundant to
Giving you further time.
We have one person who would like to comment, and we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so please come. Start. He is the head of the Department of Economics of Patna College.
Mr. Chairman, I am thanking you for having given me the opportunity to express my views. I'm conscious of the time and I observe. One thing that I wish to stress at the outset is that no change in itself or by itself is desirable or undesirable unless it is related to the objectives for the fulfillment of which it is to be brought about. So is the case with the free market, which we want to introduce on a scale which deserves to be debated in context of India. I think the approach to this issue should be not so much theoretical, but inductive, empirical. Because conditions of country vary over time and space. from this point of view, I think, so far as market mechanism is concerned, we should try to assess whether the preconditions necessary for the effective working of the market mechanism in India are or are not. Because you can borrow any idea, but if your soil is not suited to that, the results will not follow. We had a notion of social ownership, and we had a mix-up of private and public sector mix-up. But that, to a certain extent, did deliver this. I don't say that failed altogether. But in certain areas, it created problems with which we are faced at the moment. Therefore, the market mechanism that we are trying to adopt, now we should ask the question, and I would like to be enlightened on this issue, that should we go in for marketization or privatization, whatever you call it, on a massive scale so as to engulf the whole Indian economy? Should we have a selective approach? And number two, if the change is to be introduced, what should be the speed of change? Now, should it be introduced with a big bang, as it is suggested in certain quarter, or should it be introduced in a phased manner? So far as market is concerned, the little that I know is that the basic forces are demand and supply. If you want to have efficiency, and the word efficiency also requires to be interpreted, whether it is in monetary terms, whether it is only in private terms of private cost, whether it is in terms of social cost also, because these have certain relevance, or competitiveness. Now, the two forces which are at the back of the market mechanism are demand and supply. If the forces are not working properly, then the resultant is a price formation. Now that price will not be formed in a manner so as to enhance the efficiency or to ensure optimum allocation of resources as is made out in there. What is the position in India? I am not concerned with it. Do we have the two forces working in a manner to give us the ideal interaction and optimum formation of price? Objective. Long back, John Strachey, in his book Contemporary Economics, had written that even in the capitalist system there has been metamorphosis of capitalism. And the number of the producer has declined and the size has increased, so that we instead of have a pure or perfect competition, we have monopolistic competition, dominance. And in this situation, we don't have the desirable result from social angle, from the interaction of the demand-supply forces. What is the situation in India? Does it ensure formation of price which will be conducive to maximization of efficiency? Will it be a guide to optimum allocation of resources, particularly land and labor and capital? And we are having the problem of unemployment, which at the moment is one of the most important problems in the Indian economy. It is generating not only economic problems, many other problems in political sphere, in social sphere. A host of problems are arising in our country at the moment on this account. So, I think the efficiency, as I have been able to understand, in a market economy is the resultant of the operation of two mechanisms, two the processes. One is the mechanism of reward and the other is the mechanism of punishment, the positive and it is the admixture of the two that can ensure efficiency at the socially desirable level. Now my question is, can market mechanism in context of India in 1992, because the picture changes from time to time and from country to country, do we feel that price mechanism can ensure the optimum blend of these two basic mechanisms of reward and punishment, which will ensure the desirable level of efficiency in the country. I am also concerned, and I would like to share with you this view, that any system does not operate in vacuum. It has certain environment, and perhaps in Indian context, I am talking of India at the moment. Now, there are many factors which determine the totality of factors external to the man, the environmental factors. But perhaps, comparatively speaking, I say there are many, but you have to assign weightage because they are not equally important. At the moment, to me, it appears that the political factor is perhaps the most important, because all the economic decisions are taken at the highest level by the political apparatus. Therefore, one of the essential preconditions for the success of market mechanism also is that we have the right type of political apparatus. Now, the point that I wish to stress therefore is that the market pure free is something which I think is irrelevant to my mind. It is nowhere free. In the 30s itself, that is dead. Keynes came as a doctor because he introduced the concept of controlled capitalism. And then that kind of free, now that free is completely free, and it is no longer in existence in any part of the country. So, some of the questions that I have raised, I would like to be enlightened on that point, and I would like to stress, in my humble opinion, there is nothing new about privatization, as has been said at the outset of this conference. We had a mix on it. And the first Prime Minister, I think, was a visionary, because he gave a concept which is applicable to the world at large at the moment. You can have the mixture of 60-40 or 80-20, but he did visualize a system in which both the hands will be there. What will be the relative importance will be decided with reference to a particular country and a particular time. Now, therefore, market mechanism as such is neither to be decried, not to be opposed, not to be supported, unless and until it proves that the objectives which we want to fulfill with its help will be fulfilled, or we are creating conditions for its effective working, so that we have growth, we have justice also. Because it has become abundantly clear that mere production-oriented approach will not solve the problem of India. We must have the distributive justice along with the productive efficiency. Equity and efficiency both have to be combined. The question is, will private mechanism, if relied fully, deliver this food? Because our change, as I said in the beginning, we should not change for the sake of change. We should ask for, we should try for change, so that we may improve, so that we may achieve the objectives. And the broad objectives are that we, along with production, we should have justice. And justice sectional, inter-regional, between people. All dimensions of justice will have to be taken account, and this, if you go deeper, will involve even the problem of unemployment, which is also rising at a rate faster than employment, which is also rising. I won't say that employment has not risen, employment has risen, but unemployment has risen at a rate faster than that. With these words, that I even thank you for having given me the opportunity to discuss.
Thank you. Last speaker, and absolutely the last one, is Dr. Vijit Prasutta.
After listening to various speakers in the two sessions, I would like to make a few comments, very brief comments. First of all, I think we need more empirical data in this kind of discussion about the role of the state in development, particularly the role of free market in development. If possible, state-wise data. Now, I have been working on the role of the state in Bengal, the role of the state in development or underdevelopment. In Bengal, I mean West Bengal and Bangladesh. And I have noticed that the state played a different kind of role in West Bengal. I wanted to compare West Bengal and Bangladesh. The point I want to mention here is that we don't have to take examples from Latin America or from other parts of the world. We can see just now next door, if we compare our situation with Bangladesh, which followed an open market economy in the 70s and 80s, and now they are paying the price. I wanted to go into the details on this question, and I have observed that this is something which is missing in Bangladesh even today, that is the supporting role of the state in its development program, which I found in West Bengal. West Bengal model has been criticized by various writers, economists, sociologists, that it's a social democratic kind of reform. Or some writers have said that there are very clear class biases in this program. I am very critical, and I don't have time. I work on this problem to examine the nature of various programs taken up by the government of West Bengal. The main point that I would like to emphasize here today is that we have learned a lot with this kind of experiments with open economy, with market economy, fair economy. And I think that it's high time we realize that the state has a very important role to play for a country like India or in South Asia in general. And I think we have to be very, very careful when you talk about free economy, free market in this subcontinent. And I think we have to learn a lot from experiences in neighboring countries, and I think we'll have to learn a lot from experiences that many states in India have gained during the last 2 decades. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now close this evening session. Tomorrow we will start precisely at 9 a.m. Thank you.